The last thing my brother said to me was that I was being dramatic. I need to put that down first, before I account for anything else, before the bunker and the days and the people who found their way to it, before the math, which is what I did instead of grieving. He said it on the phone, standing in his kitchen in Sacramento, while I was standing in a gas station in Elko, Nevada, watching a man on the other side of the pump bay do something with his hands that hands don't do. I told him what I was seeing. He said, "Vera, you're being dramatic." I said, "Joel, I need you to get in your car right now." He said he had a meeting at 2. The call ended because I dropped the phone when the man walked through the gas station window. Not through the door, through the window, as if the glass were a suggestion. My name is Vera Solis. I was 38 years old on April 4th when I watched that happen. I worked as a cadastral land surveyor for a federal contracting firm out of Boise, mapping property boundaries, mineral rights corridors, and access routes across the Great Basin. Not glamorous work, not the kind of work that announces itself at dinner parties. But it meant I knew the land. Not the way a hiker knows it, the way a doctor knows a body. Every drainage, every ridge, every access road that didn't appear on consumer maps, because it existed for a water authority or a mining company or a federal agency that had been using it since before most of the people in the nearest town were born. I knew where the blank spaces were, and I knew what was in them. I got in my truck and drove east, not toward Sacramento, away from it, away from Joel and his 2 o'clock meeting, and the man walking through a window and every person at every pump on that lot who had stopped what they were doing and was looking at the wrong thing, which is always the thing you do right before the wrong thing reaches you. I drove east because east was where the blank spaces were, and the blank spaces were where I was going. The cabin at Mineral Springs Draw had been in my survey notes for 4 years. Not a cabin in the way people picture when they say cabin. A structure, a mining survey station from the late 1940s that a tungsten company had built into the base of a sandstone escarpment on BLM land in Elko County, approximately 63 miles northeast of town on roads that appeared on no recreational map and on exactly 2 agency documents that I knew of. I'd surveyed the access corridor in 2020 for a right-of-way assessment. The station was intact. Concrete block construction on a poured foundation, set back into the rock so that the rear wall was the escarpment itself. 3 rooms. A main room, 14 by 16 feet. A storage room that had been used for core samples, and a mechanical room that housed a pump pulling from an underground spring that the mining company had discovered and developed in 1952, and that was still running when I visited, still pushing clean cold water through corroded pipe at a rate of approximately 4 gallons per minute. I'd written it in my notes as a curiosity. A structure so remote and so forgotten that it had existed for 70 years, without appearing in any database I'd encountered, except the one I'd built myself. I'd thought about it a few times since. Not seriously. The way you think about a place that stays in your mind for no articulable reason. It stayed in mine. 4 years later, driving east on a county road with the radio cycling through emergency broadcasts, and the voice on the emergency broadcast using the specific vocabulary of institutions that had encountered something they were not prepared to name, I understood why it had stayed. Because somewhere below whatever I thought I was, I had always known. Not what specifically, but that. The gap between the world as it was supposed to be and the world as it might become. I had always known the gap was smaller than anyone wanted to say. I reached the access turnoff at dusk. The road was a 2-track that branched off a secondary county road behind a cattle gate with a combination lock that the BLM used for range management. I knew the combination because I'd requested it from the district office during the right-of-way survey. I'd written it in my field notes. I drove through, rechained the gate, and followed the 2-track for 11 miles through sage and juniper, and then into the draw itself, which narrowed as it climbed until the truck was brushing cedar on both sides, and the headlights were all that existed. The station appeared at the end of the draw as a dark shape against darker rock. I sat in the truck with the engine off for 4 minutes, listening. Wind in the cedar, the creek somewhere below, the particular silence of a place that has not had a person in it for a long time. I got out. The front door was padlocked. I had a bolt cutter in the survey kit in the bed. I'd carried it for years for locked fence gates on access routes. I used it now. Inside, the main room smelled of dust and rust, and the faint mineral smell of water moving through old iron pipe. I put my headlamp on and stood in the middle of the room. The shelving along the wall held abandoned equipment, core sample canisters, clipboard holders, a row of pegs where someone had hung gear 70 years ago and no one had removed it. The floor was concrete. The walls were concrete block with a single small window facing south, high up, the kind of window designed for ventilation rather than view. I put my hand on the rear wall. It was the escarpment. Stone, solid, cold the way things are cold when they have been underground. I said out loud to no one, "This will hold." Then I went back to the truck and began moving supplies. I want to be accurate about what I had. Not because the inventory was impressive. It wasn't. My truck was a work vehicle. I kept it stocked for field surveys that could run long or go sideways. Water, 3 5-gallon jugs, plus the spring, which I tested on the second day and confirmed was running clean at just under a gallon a minute, which was more water than I could use. Food, an emergency kit I'd built over 2 years because I surveyed remote terrain and had been caught in weather events twice, and twice was enough to change behavior. 14 days of food at my consumption. Not 14 days of good food. 14 days of calories, protein bars, freeze-dried meals requiring water, rice in sealed bags, cooking oil, salt, coffee, because I'd learned that the morning you run out of coffee is the morning everything else feels worse than it is. Medical, a survey kit that I'd supplemented personally, because federal kit standards are designed for administrators to approve, not for people doing actual work in actual terrain. Antibiotics, suture material, trauma dressings, medications for myself that I won't specify except to say that being without them in a crisis was not an option I was willing to encounter. Tools, the bolt cutter, a multi-tool, a folding saw for clearing brush on access routes, a hand level and a compass because those were as natural to me as a stethoscope to a doctor, and I carried them everywhere. Radio, a Garmin in reach, which used satellite messaging and had a battery life of several days, and a hand crank emergency radio that picked up AM, FM, and NOAA weather. Firearm, a .357 revolver that I'd carried in the field since an encounter with a dog pack on a survey in Humboldt County that I still thought about when I was deciding whether to carry. 6 cylinders, 1 spare speed loader, 12 rounds total. I laid everything on the concrete floor of the main room and looked at it. 14 days of food, indefinite water, a solid structure no one knew existed, a road that didn't appear on any recreational map, and 63 miles between me and the nearest population center. I did not feel safe, but I felt like someone who had made a decision that could be built on. That is a different thing. The first 3 days were work.
your
Work
friend
is
Owen.
what I did
Oh my
instead of
God,
calling
Lev,
Joel
now?
back.
It seemed
I
really
inventoried
awkward.
the storage
Just
room.
go.
The mining company's abandoned equipment included 2 kerosene lanterns with partial fuel, a hand pump that duplicated the electric pump as a backup, a crate of survey stakes that were useless for their
I did it.
original purpose and useful
Come
for a
on.
dozen others.
Can we
And in a
take a minute
locked
and be
metal
impressed by
cabinet,
me?
I opened with the
Not yet.
multi-tool.
What?
3 boxes of 9mm ammunition
Why?
belonging to a caliber
You'll
I
see.
didn't carry. I noted this in my field book. A 9mm handgun was somewhere
Holy
in this
shit,
area,
Lev.
or had been in
It's gonna be
1952,
okay. Eyes on
and
me.
was no longer here.
Shit.
I noted the ammo as a contingency requiring resolution. On day 2, I scouted the draw on foot. I want to describe this correctly because my survey training changed what I saw compared to what a non-surveyor would have seen. When I looked at terrain, I saw axis. Not beauty, not threat in the dramatic sense. Axis. Where could a
How are you
person
not
approach
terrified
from?
of this?
Where would
Don't
water
quote the
flow
prophet
in a
to me.
rain event? Where was the
Heights
sight
never
line
scared
from the
me.
road to the station?
It does.
And at what distance would a
ocean.
vehicle headlight become visible?
Dogs.
The draw was defensible in the specific way that geography defends without effort. It was accessible by exactly one route. The 2-track which ended at the station. The escarpment walls rose steeply on 3 sides. Not cliffs, but steep enough that anyone approaching cross-country would be moving slowly, making noise and visible from the station's south window. The creek drainage to the north was the only alternative approach, and it was seasonal. In April it ran, which meant the sound of moving water would mask footsteps. In summer it would dry, which meant the gravel bed would announce them. I wrote this in the field book. Then I wrote, sole access
How are you
point
not
is the gate.
terrified of this?
Gate is
Don't
11
quote the
miles
prophet
down
to
the
me.
draw. Gate
Heights
combination
never
is
scared
known to
me.
BLM district
It does.
office and was visible on the
The
lot
ocean.
when I arrived. Assume it is not secure.
Holy fuck.
That was the structural flaw. I knew it on day 2. I didn't know what to do about it, so I wrote it down and kept working. On day 3, the NOAA weather broadcast died.
Oh my God.
Not faded,
Almost
died.
there.
Mid-sentence,
Shit.
the forecaster
look,
was
you can see the
describing a
hospital now.
ridge of high pressure over the Great
Whoa,
Basin,
fuck.
which was
Focus
true
on me.
and confirmed by
can't
what
do
I
this,
could
Lev.
see outside.
I can't do this.
And then the sentence
Yes, you
stopped
can.
at the word
I
expect,
can't.
and the
Going
frequency
to.
became
Come on,
static.
shoot straight.
I sat with the radio on my knee for a long time. Then I tuned through every frequency I could reach. Most of it was static. On-amp faint. A station from Salt Lake City running what sounded like an automated loop. Remain indoors. Avoid contact with affected individuals. Emergency services are responding. It had the quality of a recording that had been running since, before anyone was still there to update it. I turned the radio off. I ate a protein bar. I thought about Joel. He had been in his kitchen when I called. I had heard the kitchen, sounds behind his voice. The specific sound of the particular brand of coffee maker he used, because it was the same brand as our mother's and he'd bought it after she died and kept it as a functional memorial. I had heard it running. I thought about what the kitchen sounded like now. I put that in the sealed room in my mind where I was putting everything about Joel, and I opened the field book and started calculating how to extend 14 days of food into something more sustainable. On day 8, I heard the first sound from outside that wasn't weather. Not at the station. Down the draw. I was running the pump line check, verifying the connection between the electric pump and the storage point in the main room, and I heard it. A vehicle. The specific diesel, sound of a truck on rough road. I went to the south window. The draw was too curved to see far, but the sound was deafening. A vehicle was on the 2-track below me, moving slowly. I took the revolver from the shelf where I'd placed it, and I stood to the side of the door for 20 minutes. The sound didn't come closer.
I'm dizzy.
Then it stopped. I heard a door close. Then footsteps on gravel.
Hold on!
Then nothing for a long time. Then someone outside said, in a voice that was doing the opposite of projecting, "If this is the survey station, I'm not going to hurt anyone. I have a daughter and she's sick." I held the revolver at my side. "I'm a land surveyor," the voice said. "I found the access route on a BLM survey document from 2020. Your name is listed as the primary contact." I closed my eyes briefly. My name was on the document.
Please.
Of course, my name was on the document.
Okay.
"I'm going to set something down on the ground and step back," the voice said. "It's a water bottle, sealed. I'm not asking to come inside. I'm asking for water from the spring."
Okay.
I opened the door. His name was Calvin Rhea. He was 46 years old, a hydrologist for a state agency who had spent 20 years doing water rights surveys across the Great Basin. He knew the terrain the same way I knew it.
I don't know.
Differently,
What do you mean?
he knew where the water
This is
was.
the right building. but
His daughter's name was
I've never
Priya.
been to this part of it.
She was 9 years old and she had a respiratory infection. She'd been managing for 3 days with ibuprofen
Let's see if we
and the
can find our own
contents
way
of a
down.
first aid kit that Calvin described
Nice
with the
job.
frustrated precision of a man who knew what was in it and knew it wasn't enough. She was in the truck. He'd left her asleep in the cab with strict instructions
down.
that he'd read had made no impression on her because she was 9, and the instructions didn't account for the fact that she'd woken up the moment the truck stopped. She was standing 20 feet behind him when I
yours?
opened the door,
No.
wrapped in a
Check out the
sleeping
clothes.
bag, looking at me with the focused assessment of a child who
Let's
has
start
been
down
through
there.
something and has learned to read adults for information.
I see how
They're
this
not
works.
volunteering. I was a stranger in a doorway holding a gun. She said, "Is the water clean?"
Lev, are there
I
infected in
lowered the
this building?
revolver.
We always
"Yes,"
take
I
programs
said.
down to the bottoms.
"Good," she said,
I don't know.
because Dad's been very worried about it. Calvin looked at his daughter with the expression of a parent whose child has just accurately characterized a situation he was trying to manage. "Come inside," I said. The food calculation revised immediately. 14 days became 8 at 2 adults
Spores.
and a child who needed
Nice
more
song.
calories per pound than either of us because she was running a fever.
Do you guys not believe in gas
I told
masks?
Calvin this at the table,
We were
which
on the
was a
run.
plywood sheet across 2 sawhorses that had been in the storage room. He looked at the
Let me see what I
number.
can find.
He did
Stay
what
here.
I'd done. He set his reaction aside and engaged
Back up.
with the math. "Water's
All
not
the
the
way.
constraint," he said. "No. Food
If you
is.
die, I'll be stuck here.
Yes. What's the supplement option?"
Better start praying.
I showed him the draw on the survey map I'd made on day 2. The creek drainage, the terrain, the access points. He traced the water line north with his finger.
Okay.
"This spring," he said, pointing to a notation I'd made. "Does it surface anywhere?" "Not on this survey." "I know this formation," he said. "Devonian limestone. There are likely multiple surface expressions within half a mile."
Okay.
He pulled his own field notes from his jacket. He had notes that went back years. Surveys, water rights assessments, spring flow measurements. He found the page he wanted and set it next to my survey map. The 2 documents together showed something neither showed alone. "There's a surface spring 300 yards north," he said. "It was in a grazing assessment I did in 2016. It's too small for water rights purposes, but it's perennial." Perennial meant year-round. "What grows around it?" I said. He thought. "Watercress, sedge, likely some cress relatives." And he looked at the grazing document. "Wild onion according to the range assessment." Watercress and wild onion were calories. Not substantial ones. But they were renewable and they were there. "That changes the math," I said. "A little," he said. "A little is enough to start with." Priya, who was on the cot with her sleeping bag and a cup of water and a protein bar I'd given her, and a level of attentiveness that the fever hadn't fully suppressed, said, "Are you two going to do math for a long time?" Yes, Calvin and I said simultaneously. She pulled the sleeping bag over her head. The spring north of the station was everything Calvin had
That's
described.
good.
We found it on day 9 together, in the early
Excellent.
cold before Priya was awake. A seat, technically, not a spring in the sense of water emerging forcefully. Water reaching the surface through fracture planes in the limestone and spreading slowly across a flat of sandy soil that had accumulated in a natural depression below the escarpment. But perennial, as he'd said, and bordered by watercress so dense it overhung the water's edge on 3 sides. We filled a bag each. On the walk back, Calvin said, "You survey for a living. You read terrain differently than most people." Yes. What do you see in the draw that worries you? I looked at him. He was walking slightly ahead of me on the narrow track, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who had covered a lot of ground on foot. "The gate," I said. "Combination lock." "Yes. The BLM district office in Elko has the combination. Probably half a dozen people in the agency have it. And the survey document with this station's location listed your name," I said. "I found it in the agency database," he said, "which means anyone with access to that database could find it." We walked. "How many people have access to that database?" "In the state office, maybe 30. In the district offices across Nevada," he thought, "a few hundred." I wrote this in the field book that evening. Then I wrote, "The isolation of this location is a function of knowledge, not geography. The gate is symbolic. The survey document is a map to this station for anyone who knows to look. Below that, this is not a permanent situation. It is a starting point." The radio found us on day 14. Calvin had a more sophisticated unit than mine. A handheld ham radio, the kind that required a license to operate and that he carried for field coordination in remote survey areas. It had broader frequency range and better sensitivity than my hand crank unit. On day 14, while he was scanning frequencies in the methodical way he did everything, he found her. A woman's voice. Measured. Specific. Not broadcasting to anyone in particular, or broadcasting to everyone, which is the same thing. She identified herself as Dr. Amara Yusuf, broadcasting from what she described as a research station at approximately 7,000 feet elevation in the Ruby Mountains, 41 miles east-northeast of Elko. She gave her coordinates. She stated her group's composition, 11 people including herself. She stated their resources in the clipped inventory language of a scientist who understood that information was currency. Generator and fuel for 60 days, medical capability, limited food, water from snowmelt currently adequate. She said, "If you are in the high ground east of Elko and you can hear this, I am broadcasting on this frequency at 0700 and 1900 daily. I am a microbiologist. I have clinical information about the infection that may be relevant to your decisions. I will share it freely." Calvin looked at me across the plywood table. Priya looked up from the drawing she'd been doing. She had claimed a small corner of the main room for her drawings, the same way she'd claimed the specific cot closest to the pump room, without asking, with the natural authority of a 9-year-old who had learned that the best way to establish belonging was to simply inhabit space. "She's a microbiologist," Priya said. "Yes," Calvin said. "So she knows what's happening." "She knows something about what's happening," I said. "That's more than we know." It was. I picked up Calvin's radio and transmitted on the frequency. "Dr. Yusuf, this is Vera Solis, land surveyor, broadcasting from a remote station approximately 22 miles northwest of your position. Group of 3, water secure, food for 9 more days." I released the transmit button. We waited. At 1901, she answered. Dr. Yusuf's clinical information changed the threat model. I want to describe what she told us accurately, because accuracy is what I owe this account. She had been at the Ruby Mountain Research Station, conducting a soil microbiology study, when the outbreak began. The station was a university field facility. Small, designed for 6, holding 11 because 3 researchers and 2 graduate students had driven up from Elko on day 1, when the situation became clear, and because 3 additional people had arrived on foot over the subsequent 2 weeks. She had training in infectious disease. More relevantly, she had been listening to infected movement in the terrain below the station for 2 weeks, and she had been doing what scientists do with observations. Categorizing them. They don't respond to sight, she told us on the second broadcast exchange. I've tested this directly. They don't track visual stimuli in the way an intact nervous system would. They respond to heat, sound, and, I believe, vibration through ground contact. Footsteps register differently than voice. Calvin was listening with a notebook open. The temperature threshold, I said. Yes, cold suppresses activity, not eliminates, suppresses. Below approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit, their movement becomes significantly reduced. They don't seek shelter. They don't metabolize heat the way an intact body does. They dissipate. Like ectotherms, Calvin said. Behaviorally, yes. The neurological mechanism is different, but the thermal response pattern is similar. You can see them from the station. Below the 7,200-foot contour, yes. I've been logging density and movement patterns for 12 days. What's the lower boundary for reduced activity? I estimate 5,000 feet at current temperatures. The valley floor is running warm. The infection density is highest there. It thins with elevation. I looked at the map. The station at Mineral Springs Draw sat at 6,400 feet. Above the lower boundary. Below the Ruby Mountain facility by 600 feet. In the zone she was describing as manageable. I wrote elevation is not incidental, it is structural. Dr. Yusuf, I said into the radio, you said you have medical capability. What specifically? A pause. I'm a microbiologist, not a clinician. But I have a colleague with me who was a trauma surgeon before she moved into research. And we have a full field medical kit plus what we carried in from the vehicles. We have a child with a respiratory infection, I said. How old? 9. Symptoms. I described what Priya had. The fever that had reduced but not resolved. The cough that was productive in the mornings. The fatigue. That sounds bacterial, she said. Secondary infection following a viral event. She needs antibiotics. I have antibiotics in my medical kit, I said. What spectrum? I named them. That will work, the dosing for a 9-year-old. I know the dosing, I said. A brief pause. Of course you do, she said. You came prepared. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was recognition. The recognition of one prepared person by another. Priya was on antibiotics by that evening. Her fever broke on day 17. She ate a full meal for the first time since arriving. She drew a picture of the station and labeled every room including the pump room, which she labeled pump room important, and gave it to Calvin without comment, which was how she gave most things. Day 21 brought the third person. Not from below. From the East Ridge. I was outside at dawn, running the perimeter check I'd implemented on day 3, when I saw movement on the escarpment above the station. A figure on the steep slope, moving carefully. Not the movement of the infected. The infected moved with a specific carelessness about terrain that was one of the ways you identified them at distance. They moved as if the ground were flat, regardless of grade. This figure was negotiating the slope with attention, testing footholds, using hands on the steeper sections. Alive, intentional, cautious. I stood in the open and waited. The figure saw me and stopped. For 30 seconds, neither of us moved. Then the figure raised one hand. Palm open. I raised one hand back. He came down. His name was Theo Park. He was 51 years old, and he had been a wildfire behavior analyst for the Forest Service for 22 years. He had been at a remote monitoring station on the Eastern Ridge when the outbreak began, conducting a fire behavior assessment of the previous season's burn areas. He had been on the ridge for 18 days. Alone. He had not come down because the ridge had given him visibility, and the visibility had told him that coming down was the wrong direction. He had seen our station from the ridge line. Not immediately. On day 6, when I'd had a lantern running in the main room for a night, the light had reached his observation point. He had spent 12 days watching before he decided to approach. 12 days of watching. I thought about what that cost. I didn't ask him about it directly. He was the kind of person where asking directly would have been the wrong kind of question. But over the following days, I learned what 12 days alone on a ridge looked like. He ate what he could find, pine nuts, the dried venison strips he'd brought for the survey. He slept in a surveying tent rated for 3 seasons that was serving in season 4 under protest. He'd maintained a daily observation log. Not because he'd been trained to specifically. Because it was what he did when a situation was uncertain. He observed. He recorded. He looked for the pattern that the data contained. He handed me his observation log on day 23. I read it for 2 hours. It was the most comprehensive picture of the draw's infected movement pattern that anyone had. 12 days of hourly observations. Movement timing. Density estimates. Behavioral notes. The cold window, which he'd identified on day 3. The fact that sound appeared to precede visual detection in infected response. The fact that 2 individuals had approached the gate on day 9 and stood at it for approximately 4 hours before drifting back down the draw. The gate stopped them, I said. Yes and no, he said. The gate stopped their forward movement, but what stopped them from going around the gate was the terrain. The draw walls are steep on both sides at that point. They didn't navigate around it. They followed the path. They followed the gradient. He paused. Fire does the same thing. It follows the path of least resistance. Grade, fuel, wind. These things follow grade and density gradient. You think you can model it. I know I can model it. I've been doing it for terrain systems my entire career. The terrain is the same, I said. The variable is what's moving through it. Yes, and the variable has consistent rules. He looked at my field book. May I? I handed it to him. He read it carefully, the way a person reads a document they respect. Then he opened his own log and set it beside mine. I think together we have most of what we need, he said. For what? For predicting where they'll be and when. And if we can predict where they'll be, we can be somewhere else. I tried calling Joel on day 24. Not the phone, the inReach. It had satellite messaging capability that didn't depend on the cellular network. I'd been avoiding using it because using it meant knowing. I typed a message to his number. Joel, it's Vera. I'm safe. Are you safe? Please respond. I sent it. I watched the delivery confirmation come back. Message sent. Not delivered. Message sent meant the satellite had received it. Not delivered meant the receiving device hadn't confirmed receipt, which meant the device was either off or destroyed, or in a location without power. Or it meant the person who carried it was no longer carrying it. I kept the in reach in my jacket pocket for the next 11 days. It did not chime. I did not send another message. I continued working. The combined knowledge of 4 people changed what we were. I want to be precise about this. Before Calvin and Theo, the station had been a place where one person was surviving. After, it was a place where 4 people were operating. The distinction is the difference between endurance and function. Calvin mapped the water system. Not just the spring and the creek, the entire hydrological picture of the draw and the surrounding terrain. Where water moved underground, where it surfaced, where it accumulated, where it dried. This gave us a resource picture that was more complete than anything I'd built alone. The watercress seep was the first supplement. Calvin identified 3 more within a mile. The spring in the mechanical room was one of 6 surface expressions of the same aquifer, he believed. We had more water than we could use. Theo's fire behavior modeling translated directly to infected movement prediction. He ran it the same way. Terrain grade, ambient temperature, sound events. He built a 24-hour prediction map that told us when and where infected individuals were likely to be at any given point in the draw's approach corridor. The cold window was real. He refined it. Not just temperature combined with cloud cover. On overcast nights, the thermal gradient between the draw floor and the surrounding terrain compressed, and the cold window shortened. On clear nights, radiative cooling from the draw floor created a cold pool effect that extended the window by as much as 90 minutes. This information saved us on day 31, when I would have opened the hatch outside the correct window and encountered 2 individuals at the base of the escarpment that Theo's model had flagged. I trusted the model. I waited. 40 minutes later, they were gone. Priya, who had recovered fully by day 25 and had established herself as the station's principal observer from the south window during daytime hours, confirmed they'd drifted back toward the 2-track. Following the gradient. Like water. Like fire. The radio brought Dr. Yusuf's information in pieces, across many broadcasts. I want to give you the picture she built for us, because it changed how we understood our situation. Not the outbreak's origin. She was careful to say she didn't have that. The behavior. The infection affects the prefrontal cortex first, she told us on day 19. Voluntary decision-making, spatial planning, threat assessment. These are the functions that go. What remains is the older system. Brainstem, limbic, metabolic response to environmental stimulus. They are operating on survival impulse without survival strategy, Theo said. Yes, that's a good way to put it. They respond to threat stimuli, but they can't plan a response. They approach heat because heat is metabolically relevant. They respond to sound because sound signals presence. But they can't flank. They can't wait. They can't coordinate. What about groups? I asked. We've observed clustering. Not coordination, she said. Convergence. They respond to the same stimuli and arrive at the same point independently. The appearance of coordination is coincidental. Like iron filings and a magnet. Exactly. Remove the magnet and they disperse. There's no group behavior without the stimulus. This changed the threat model in a practical way. A cluster was a response to something. Find the something, remove or relocate it, the cluster dispersed. We were the something, which meant we needed to be a smaller signal. We'd already learned some of this empirically. No lanterns after dark. After Theo confirmed, they responded to the light from the main room window on day 6 of his observation. Minimal conversation outdoors. Footsteps on the gravel approach were the primary concern. Theo had observed that footstep vibration transmitted through the draw's compacted soil in a way that voice didn't. We moved outside in soft-soled shoes on the gravel sections and shifted to a worn dirt path that ran parallel to the gravel where possible. These were small adjustments, but small adjustments compounded. By day 40, the infected approach rate to the station had dropped measurably from the baseline Theo had established in his log. Not because there were fewer of them, because we'd learned to be quieter than they could hear. The decision about the Ruby Mountains came on day 43. Dr. Yusuf's generator fuel was declining faster than projected. A calculation error in the original estimate, she said without effect, because she was a scientist and the error deserved acknowledgement rather than management. 60 days had become 41. At 41 days, the generator died. Without the generator, the research station's well pump stopped. Without the well pump, 11 people at 7,200 feet in a facility without natural water access had days. She presented this in the 0700 broadcast on day 43, with the same structured calm she brought to everything. "We need to move," she said. "I believe the station at Mineral Springs Draw represents a viable alternative. I'm asking whether you'll receive us." I looked at Calvin. He was already looking at me. The math was simple. 4 people, station designed for a small survey crew. 14 people, which was 11 plus our 3 plus Priya. Food that had been extended to roughly 22 days through foraging and careful rationing. Extended across 14 people, 7 days. 1 week. After 1 week, we would need to have solved a food problem that we had not yet solved. I did the math out loud. Not to discourage the decision. Because Theo and Calvin and Dr. Yusuf all thought in numbers, and numbers were the language where honesty lived. 7 days, I said. Yes, Calvin said. Can we solve the food problem in 7 days? Theo had the survey map open. He pointed to a location 6 miles south of the station. A ranch site that appeared in the BLM land records as an agricultural easement. He'd noted it on day 20 while extending his terrain analysis. Abandoned working ranch, he said. The infrastructure will include feed storage, probably grain, root cellar likely given the age of the operation, and a kitchen with canned goods if the site is intact. We don't know if it's intact. No. We don't know if it's occupied. No. We don't know the infected density on the access route. No. He looked at me. But Yusuf's group has a trauma surgeon. Yes. And 3 people who know the Ruby Mountains terrain. Yes. And 11 people who have survived 43 days in a field facility above 7,000 feet. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I transmitted to Yusuf. We'll receive you, I said. Bring everything, travel in the cold window. I'll send you the timing model. A pause. Then thank you, Vera. She said my name the same way Calvin had said it when I opened the door of the station. Not as greeting. As confirmation. They arrived on day 46. 11 people. I watched them come up the draw in the pre-dawn dark. A loose column moving quietly, carrying what they could carry. Dr. Yusuf was at the front. She was taller than her voice suggested. 44 years old, with close-cropped hair and the specific quality of stillness in her face that I associated with people who processed a great deal of information internally before any of it showed. The trauma surgeon was a woman named Dr. Park. No relation to Theo. She was 52. She had left academic medicine 6 years earlier and had been at the Ruby Mountain Station as a researcher. She looked at Priya when she arrived and said, "She recovered well from the respiratory infection." It wasn't a question. She'd been told about Priya over the radio. She was confirming her own assessment. "Yes," I said. "Good." The others were researchers, 2 graduate students, a facilities manager named Oren who turned out to be the most broadly capable person I had ever met in a practical sense, and 4 people who had arrived at the Ruby Mountain Station from lower ground over the previous weeks and whose backgrounds range from retired teacher to long-haul trucker, to a woman named Sable who had been an apiary keeper and who would, within the next 2 months, become the station's most important resource person, for reasons none of us anticipated on day 46. The station, which had been 4 people in 2 rooms, became 14 people in every room including the pump room, which Oren inspected and improved within 48 hours of arrival, with a professionalism that made Calvin and me feel appropriately humbled. "You know pump systems," Calvin said. "I ran a water treatment facility for 19 years, Oren said. He did not say this as a credential. He said it as a fact relevant to the current problem. He was the kind of person where everything he said was relevant to the current problem. The food problem had 7 days to solve itself. It solved itself in 3 because of the ranch. Theo led the scouting run on day 48. Himself, Dr. Park, who insisted on attending field operations because a surgeon in a stationary facility was a surgeon waiting for injuries to come to her, and Oren, because Oren had looked at the map and identified the access route and said he knew that ranch. He had delivered a water treatment component to it in 2019. The owner had been a man in his 70s who lived alone with 2 dogs and ran a small cattle operation. The ranch was empty. Not cleared. Empty the way a place becomes empty when the person who inhabited it has been removed by circumstances rather than intent. The kitchen held a cellar with 400 pounds of preserved goods. Canned, dried, sealed. The feed storage held grain for livestock that was no longer there, but that was still food in the sense that mattered. The garden had been planted for spring and was weeks away from producing anything, but it was planted and it was there. They drove back in the ranch's truck, which had half a tank of diesel and which Oren had assessed as mechanically sound. When the supplies came through the station door, Dr. Yusuf counted them with the same expression Calvin had worn when the spring was confirmed. Not relief. The muscular beginning of planning. "How long?" she said. I did the math. 14 people at survival rations, supplement with forage, the garden producing in 4 to 6 weeks. "How long?" she said again. 4 months, I said. "With the garden." "Longer." She nodded once. Wrote something in her own notebook. "Then we have time to solve the next problem." "What's the next problem?" She looked up. "Medical supplies. We have enough for acute care for approximately 60 days. After that, we're dependent on what can be foraged or fabricated." She looked at me steadily. "I believe Sable can help with that." I looked at Sable, who was in the corner of the main room helping Priya organize the drawings she'd been making into some kind of coherent order that only the 2 of them understood. "Apiary," I said. "Honey," Dr. Yusuf said, "propolis, beeswax, all with medical applications." And beyond that, she looked at Calvin. "He's a hydrologist. He can find where we need to go to find what we need. And you." She looked at me. "You know where everything is." "I want to tell you about day 112. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was the day I understood what we had built." Priya had expanded her drawing practice into something she called the station map. Not a floor plan. a complete spatial record of everything within 3 miles. She walked the terrain with Calvin and with me, separately, asking questions, recording answers in her notebooks in a handwriting that had become precise in a way that 9-year-old handwriting usually isn't. She drew the spring, the seep, the watercress flats. She drew the 2-track and the cattle gate. She drew the escarpment and the ridge line and the approach corridors that Theo had modeled. She drew the ranch and the route to it. She drew every observation point and every resource location and every known hazard. On day 112, she presented the map at the morning briefing. It covered 4 large sheets of graph paper taped together. It was the most accurate spatial record of our operational area that existed. Better than my survey notes. More complete than Theo's observation log. It incorporated Calvin's hydrological data and Oren's infrastructure assessments and Sable's foraging range and Dr. Park's notes on terrain hazards from the supply runs. It was built from every person's knowledge at once. Dr. Yusuf, who ran the morning briefings with a structure I recognized as the same structure I used when I needed to think clearly in difficult terrain, looked at the map for a long time. Then she said, "This is what we are." Nobody answered, because the map was self-explanatory. 14 people, every discipline represented, every knowledge type documented. Not a shelter. An operation. The inReach chimed on day 147. I was outside, running the morning perimeter. I stopped. I pulled the device from my jacket pocket. A message. Not from Joel's number. From a number I didn't recognize. "This is Rosa Solis, Sacramento. I am Joel's wife. He asked me to contact you if anything happened to him. Joel was injured in late April. He is recovering. He is alive. We are with a group in the Sierras, El Dorado National Forest, east of Placerville. If you are Vera and you are alive, please respond." I stood in the draw in the early light with the device in my hand. Rosa Solis. I hadn't known his wife's name was Rosa. He'd met her after the last time I'd visited. He'd mentioned her 3 times on the phone over the past year. He'd said she was good for him. He'd said it with the shy deflection that Joel used for things that mattered. Joel was injured. He is recovering. He is alive. I read the message 5 times. Then I sat down on the gravel path and allowed myself, for the first time since April, to feel the thing I had been keeping in the sealed room. Not grief. The reverse of grief. The thing that looks like grief from the outside because it has the same physical expression, but is in fact the release of the tension that grief prevention requires. I did not go to pieces. I was not built for that. I sat on the gravel for 4 minutes and breathed and held the device and thought about Joel in a kitchen in Sacramento with a coffee maker that sounded like our mother's. Then I typed a message. "Rosa, this is Vera. I am alive. I am in Elko County, Nevada with a group of 14 people in a secure location. Joel is alive. That is enough for now. Tell him I drove north. He'll understand." I sent it. The delivery confirmation came back in under a minute. Delivered. I put the device in my pocket and finished the perimeter check. Calvin was at the pump when I came in. He looked at my face. He said nothing. He handed me a cup of the coffee that Oren had figured out how to approximate using chicory root that Sable had identified in the upper drawer. It didn't taste like coffee. It tasted like something warm and deliberate. That was enough. Day 209. The garden produced its first real harvest. Potatoes primarily, onions, the beginning of a bean crop that would mature in another 3 weeks. Dr. Park ran the caloric assessment. The combined output of the garden, the ranch cellar reserves, and the foraging range was approaching self-sufficiency. Not quite. Approaching. The direction of the math had changed. We were no longer calculating how long we had. We were calculating how to extend what we were producing. The direction of a calculation is everything. Declining is a countdown. Growing is something else. Something that doesn't have a name in the survival vocabulary, because survival vocabulary is built around subtraction. Orrin had extended the pump system. Not just for the station. He'd run a gravity-fed line from the higher spring to the garden. The design was his. Calvin had verified the hydrology. Theo had modeled the terrain grade. 3 people's knowledge in one piece of infrastructure. Priya had drawn it on the map before it existed, because she had watched the planning and understood where it was going before we'd finished deciding. She was 10 now. Her birthday had passed on day 158. We'd marked it with the approximation of a celebration that 14 people in a remote station in Elko County, Nevada could produce. Which was Rosa, who turned out to have been a cook before she was a truck driver before she arrived at the Ruby Mountain Station, made something from the available ingredients that tasted like a cake if you didn't think too hard about what wasn't in it. And Theo had found a viewpoint on the ridge from which, on a clear day, you could see 140 miles. He took Priya there in the afternoon. He showed her the terrain features she'd drawn on her map from above. She was quiet the whole time, Calvin told me later. Just looking. The look of a person confirming an internal picture against the actual landscape. Then she said, "It's right." She meant her map. Theo said, "It's right." He meant more than the map. Day 340. The compound held 22 people. 8 more had arrived since November. A retired veterinarian who'd been sheltering in a ranch house east of Wells. 2 brothers, early 20s, who'd spent the winter in a hunting cabin in the Independence Mountains and had followed the creek drainage west until it led them to us. A woman named Dell, who had been a structural engineer before she became a person, moving through the Nevada desert looking for elevation. 2 people from a failed group further south who had survived the failure and walked for 11 days. And a man and his teenage son who had found the cattle gate, read the combination from the wear pattern on the lock, and knocked rather than picking it. We'd let them in. The same way the station had let everyone in. Not because the math always supported it. Because the math was never the only measure. Dell had reinforced the pump room ceiling within 48 hours of arrival, which turned out to matter 3 weeks later when a seismic event cracked the escarpment above it. Small crack. No structural consequence. Because the ceiling had been reinforced. Because Dell had looked at it and seen what it needed. You carry what the situation requires. Everyone does if you let them. I stood on the south side of the station on day 365 and watched the sun come over the escarpment. I'd been awake since before it. Calvin was at the pump. Theo was at the ridgeline observation point. Dr. Yusuf was running the morning briefing preparation, which she did at 5:30 every day. Priya was asleep. She was the only one who consistently slept through the dawn. I had stopped being worried about this early on. She worked during the day with an intensity that earned the sleep. I had the in reach in my jacket pocket. Rosa had messaged twice in the past month. Joel was recovered. His injury had been significant but not catastrophic. A fall, broken ribs, a lung contusion that had been more dangerous than the break. He was functional. He was with a group in the El Dorado National Forest that numbered 31 people and was building towards something sustainable. He had asked through Rosa whether I planned to come south. I had not answered. Not because I didn't know. Because the answer required a conversation I wanted to have in person, not in satellite message. The conversation was, I had driven north instead of south on day 1. I had made the calculation that the blank spaces were survivable, and the city was not. I had been right. And I had also left my brother behind in his kitchen with his coffee maker and his 2 o'clock meeting. Both things were true. The calculation was right, and the cost of the calculation was real, and the two facts did not cancel each other. They existed together. The way the map and the terrain exist together. One is the representation. One is the thing. You need both. Joel was alive. He was 210 miles south. Through terrain I had not scouted. Through the Central Valley in summer, which the thermal gradient data suggested would be the highest infected density environment we had modeled. The math said difficult, high risk, uncertain outcome. The math said the same thing in April when Danielle had knocked on a hatch. And when Calvin had come up the draw with a sick daughter. And when Dr. Yusuf had broadcast on a frequency no one was supposed to be scanning. The math was right about the cost. The math was wrong about the value. I went to the morning briefing. Dr. Yusuf ran through reports, decisions, assignments. At the end, she asked for new business. I raised my hand. I need a route south, I said, to El Dorado County. Calvin has the hydrology. Theo has the terrain model. I need someone to help me build a movement plan for a 210-mile traverse in summer heat. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Dell said, I know that area. I surveyed highway drainage corridors in Amador County in 2018. Then Theo said, I can model the infected density gradient from elevation data. Then Calvin said, I'll pull the water sources. Then Priya said, I'll update the map. She said it with the tone of someone noting an obvious administrative task. Like it was already decided. Like the decision had already been made. It had. Not in the briefing room. In a parking lot in Elko on April 4th, when I got in the truck and drove north and told myself it was the right direction. It was. And south is also the right direction. The directions don't contradict each other. They are both on the same map. And I know how to read a map. Day 366 begins with the truck running. I have the in reach in my jacket pocket. I have the note from Rosa with the coordinates in El Dorado National Forest. I have Priya's updated map, which is more accurate than anything the agency ever produced about this terrain. And I have the field book, all 365 days of it. Every measurement, every observation, every calculation, everything I saw and wrote down accurately without embellishment. The last entry says, Day 365, Group 22, Station operational, food
People
production
cross this
sustainable,
regularly?
infected activity reduced and
You're
modeled,
lying.
route south
I'm
planned, departure window dawn.
It's not the most popular
Joel said
route.
I was being dramatic. Joel was wrong.
Oh my god.
I'll tell him so when I get there.